The scent of burning pine filled the air as flames licked across the depot roof, threatening to engulf the entire building where Lillian Brooks stood in her wedding gown, frozen with terror. The year was 1879, and what should have been the happiest day of her life in Parowan, Utah Territory, was quickly turning into a nightmare. The train station that had been decorated with white ribbons and wildflowers for her wedding reception was now becoming her funeral pyre. Lillian's breathing came in short, panicked gasps as smoke poured through the ceiling. The wedding guests had fled minutes ago when the first sparks had fallen, leaving her alone with her prized trunk, the one containing her mother's heirloom jewelry, the family Bible, and everything she'd planned to start her new life with. She couldn't leave it behind, but it was too heavy for her to carry while managing the voluminous skirts of her wedding gown. "Miss, you need to get out of here now." A deep voice cut through the crackling of flames. Through the thickening smoke emerged the tall figure of a man Lillian had never seen before. Dust-covered and weather-beaten, he wore the unmistakable garb of a cowboy, leather chaps over denim trousers, a worn cotton shirt, and boots with spurs that jangled with each hurried step. His face was partially obscured by a bandana pulled up against the smoke. "My trunk," she managed to say, pointing to the large wooden chest. "Please, it's all I have left." Without hesitation, the stranger strode across the room, lifted the heavy trunk with a grunt, and nodded toward the door. "Stay close behind me. Keep your dress up off the ground if you can." Lillian gathered her skirts and followed him as burning debris began to fall around them. The cowboy moved with determined strides, navigating through the increasingly dangerous depot with the trunk balanced against his shoulder. A support beam cracked above them, showering sparks that caught on the trim of Lillian's veil. The cowboy dropped the trunk momentarily, ripped the burning veil from her head, and stamped it out beneath his boot. "Thank you," she gasped, her eyes watering from smoke. "Save your breath," he advised, hoisting the trunk again. "Follow me and stay low." Together they pushed through the growing inferno. The main door was now blocked by flames, forcing them toward a side exit. The heat was becoming unbearable, blistering their skin and singeing their hair. Just when Lillian thought they wouldn't make it, the cowboy kicked open a door she hadn't known existed, and they stumbled into the blessed coolness of the late afternoon air. Behind them, the depot roof collapsed with a thunderous roar, sending a plume of embers skyward. The cowboy set down her trunk a safe distance away and finally pulled down his bandana, revealing a strong jawline dusted with stubble and the most startlingly blue eyes Lillian had ever seen. "Xavier Grayson," he introduced himself, offering a calloused hand. "Though most folks just call me X." Lillian took his hand, suddenly aware of the state of her ruined wedding dress and ash-streaked face. "Lillian Brooks, I'm much obliged to you, Mr. Grayson. You saved my life." He looked at her quizzically. "Where's your husband? Shouldn't he be the one helping his bride?" Lillian's gaze fell to the ground, her voice barely audible over the commotion of people fighting the fire. "He never showed up. I was waiting at the depot for the next train out when the fire started." Xavier's expression softened, something passing across his features that looked like understanding mixed with another emotion she couldn't quite place. "Well, Miss Brooks," he said quietly, "seems like we both had other plans for today that didn't work out." As the townspeople gathered to battle the blaze, neither Lillian nor Xavier could have possibly known how their chance meeting in smoke and fire would change the course of their lives forever. The fire at the Parowan depot had started from a spark thrown by a passing locomotive, catching on the dry shingles of the roof and spreading with frightening speed. While townspeople formed bucket brigades and salvaged what they could from the burning building, Lillian sat on her trunk, staring blankly at the destruction. The wedding guests had dispersed, many offering awkward condolences about both the fire and her absent groom. "Miss Brooks, you should come with me to the hotel," Mrs. Potter, the mayor's wife, suggested gently. "You can't sit here all night." "I'll be fine," Lillian insisted, her fingers worrying at the soot-stained lace of her gown. "I just need some time, Mrs." Potter hesitated but eventually rejoined the crowd, leaving Lillian alone with her thoughts. Her fiancé, Theodore Whitmore, had been due on the morning train from Salt Lake City. When he hadn't arrived, she'd waited, making excuses to the assembled guests. Perhaps the train was delayed. Perhaps there had been some misunderstanding, but as afternoon turned to evening, she'd had to face the truth. She had been abandoned at the altar. "You're still here." Lillian looked up to find Xavier standing before her, his shirt now soaked with sweat and water from fighting the fire. In one hand he held a canteen, which he offered to her. "Thank you," she said, accepting the water gratefully. "I don't know where else to go." "You're not from Parowan," she shook her head. "I came from Boston 3 months ago to marry Theodore. He owned the mercantile here." She looked toward the smoldering depot. "I was supposed to take the evening train back east after the wedding reception." Xavier settled down beside her trunk, removing his hat to run a hand through his dark hair. "That's a long way to come for a wedding that didn't happen." "Yes," Lillian agreed, a touch of bitterness creeping into her voice. "A very long way indeed." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, watching as the fire was gradually brought under control. Lillian studied the man beside her. Though coated in soot and ash, there was something solid and reassuring about Xavier Grayson. He wasn't traditionally handsome like Theodore, with his smooth hands and fine suits. Xavier was rugged, tanned by the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he smiled often, though he wasn't smiling now. "What brought you to the depot today?" she asked. "Were you leaving town too?" "No," Xavier replied, replacing his hat. "I was meeting someone, my brother. He was supposed to arrive on the afternoon train." He looked over at the charred remains of the depot. "Guess I'll be waiting a bit longer now." Lillian nodded, understanding all too well the disappointment of waiting for someone who never came. "I hope he arrives safely whenever he does come." "Oh, Tommy will turn up," Xavier said with a half-smile. "He always does, eventually." A commotion down the street caught their attention. Sheriff Mills was approaching with a telegram in hand, his expression grave. "Miss Brooks," the sheriff called, "I've just received word from Salt Lake City." He glanced uncomfortably at Xavier. "Perhaps we should speak privately." "Whatever you have to say, you can say it here," Lillian replied, suddenly afraid of what news might be coming. "Mr. Grayson saved my life today. I have no secrets from him." The sheriff cleared his throat. "Very well. It seems Mr. Whitmore boarded a train 3 days ago heading west, not east. He was seen in the company of a young woman. The telegram states he withdrew all funds from his accounts before leaving." The news, though not entirely unexpected given Theodore's absence, still hit Lillian like a physical blow. Her face paled and her hands trembled in her lap. "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for telling me, Sheriff." "There's more," Sheriff Mills continued reluctantly. "The mercantile was mortgaged to the hilt. The bank will be taking possession tomorrow. I'm sorry, Miss Brooks." As the sheriff walked away, Lillian fought back tears. Not only had she been jilted, but she was now stranded in a town where she knew almost no one, with no money beyond what she carried and nowhere to stay. Xavier stood, dusting off his trousers. "Miss Brooks, I have a small ranch about 3 miles outside of town. My housekeeper, Mrs. Landry, would be happy to give you a place to stay until you figure out your next steps." Lillian looked up at him, surprised by the offer. "That's very kind, but I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Xavier insisted, "and it's getting dark. You can't sit on your trunk all night, and the hotel's likely full with folks displaced by the fire." She knew he was right. With a small nod, she stood, smoothing down her ruined wedding dress as best she could. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson. Just X is fine," he said, lifting her trunk once more. "My wagon's this way." As they walked through town, Lillian was painfully aware of the stares and whispers that followed them, the jilted bride being escorted by the mysterious rancher who rarely came to town except for supplies. It would give the gossips something to talk about for weeks. Xavier's wagon was simple but sturdy, with a team of 2 dependable-looking bay horses waiting patiently. He loaded her trunk into the back and then offered his hand to help her up to the seat. "It's not the most comfortable ride," he apologized, climbing up beside her. "But it's better than walking 3 miles in wedding slippers." Lillian managed a small smile. "I've had worse days." I imagine you have, he replied, flicking the reins to set the horses in motion. As they left Parowan behind, the last flames of the depot fire being extinguished by determined townspeople, Lillian looked up at the vast expanse of stars appearing in the darkening sky. She had come west for a new beginning, for love and adventure. Instead, she'd found betrayal and disaster. Yet sitting beside this quiet cowboy who had risked his life to save her and her possessions, she felt a curious sense of peace settling over her. Whatever tomorrow might bring, she had survived today. Perhaps that was enough for now. The journey to Xavier's ranch took them through rolling sagebrush country, the wagon jolting over rutted trails that could barely be called roads. Lillian clung to the wooden seat, her wedding dress billowing around her like a ghostly cloud in the moonlight. Neither of them spoke much, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Xavier pointed ahead. There it is, not much to look at, but it's home. In the pale light of the rising moon, Lillian could make out the silhouette of a modest ranch house with a broad porch, flanked by a barn and several corrals. A warm light glowed from one of the windows, suggesting someone was awake inside. As they pulled up to the house, the front door opened and an older woman stepped out, a shotgun held cautiously in her hands. "It's just me, Mrs. Landry," Xavier called, "and we have a guest." The woman lowered the shotgun, squinting into the darkness. "Xavier Grayson, you know better than to come riding in after dark without warning. I could have shot you." "And a good evening to you too," Xavier replied with a wry smile as he jumped down from the wagon and came around to help Lillian descend. "This is Miss Lillian Brooks. She needs a place to stay for a while." Mrs. Landry's expression changed from suspicion to surprise as she took in Lillian's bedraggled wedding dress. "Good heavens, what happened to you, child?" "There was a fire at the depot," Xavier explained before Lillian could respond. "And her groom didn't show. Can you get her settled in the spare room? I'll bring in her trunk." The housekeeper's face softened with sympathy. "Of course. Come inside, Miss Brooks. You look half frozen and entirely exhausted." Lillian followed Mrs. Landry into the house, grateful for the warmth that greeted her. The interior was simple but comfortable, a main room with a stone fireplace, sturdy wooden furniture, and shelves lined with books. A kerosene lamp cast a golden glow over everything, making the space feel welcoming despite its sparseness. "Let's get you out of that dress," Mrs. Landry said, leading Lillian toward a back hallway. "I'm sure I can find something that will fit you well enough for tonight." The spare bedroom was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in a colorful quilt, a washstand, and a chest of drawers. A window overlooked what Lillian guessed would be a garden in daylight. "It's perfect," Lillian said, meaning it. After the events of the day, any safe, quiet place would have seemed like heaven. Mrs. Landry helped her out of the complicated wedding dress, tutting over the smoke damage and burn marks. "This is beyond saving, I'm afraid," she said, setting the ruined gown aside. "Such beautiful work, too." "It doesn't matter," Lillian replied, surprised to find she meant that too. The dress, like the future it had represented, was gone. Xavier knocked at the door, announcing he'd brought her trunk. Mrs. Landry let him set it just inside the room before shooing him away, insisting that Lillian needed rest, not conversation. After a quick wash with water from the pitcher on the stand, Lillian donned the simple cotton nightgown Mrs. Landry had provided. It was too large, clearly made for someone with a more ample figure, but it was clean and soft against her skin. "I've heated some milk with honey," Mrs. Landry said, returning with a steaming mug. "It'll help you sleep." Lillian accepted the drink gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness." "I don't know what I would have done otherwise." "No need to thank me. Any friend of Xavier's is welcome here." The older woman hesitated. "Though I must say, in all the years I've worked for him, you're the first woman he's ever brought home." Before Lillian could explain that she wasn't a friend in any real sense, Mrs. Landry continued, "Whatever happened today, it's over now. Tomorrow is a new day. Get some rest and things will look clearer in the morning." Left alone, Lillian sipped the warm milk and stared out the window at the unfamiliar landscape, bathed in moonlight. When she'd boarded the train in Boston, full of romantic notions about her new life in the West, She could never have imagined ending the day like this, a jilted bride in a stranger's home, with no plans for the future. Yet for all the tragedy of the day, she felt oddly unburdened. Perhaps Theodore's betrayal had been a blessing in disguise. Marrying a man who could abandon her so callously would have led to nothing but heartache. As she crawled beneath the quilt, her body aching from the stress and exertion of the day, Lillian's last conscious thought was of Xavier Grayson's steady hands as he'd guided her through the smoke and flames. There was something about him, something solid and trustworthy, that made her feel that, somehow, everything might turn out all right after all. Morning arrived with the crowing of a rooster and the soft clatter of activity in the kitchen. Lillian woke slowly, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar surroundings before the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up, noticing that sometime during the night, someone had opened her trunk and laid out a simple day dress across the foot of the bed, one of her own, thankfully unharmed by smoke or water. After dressing and pinning her hair into a simple knot, she made her way toward the sounds of domestic activity. The main room looked different in daylight, with sunlight streaming through windows that offered views of mountains in the distance. Mrs. Landry was at the stove, turning bacon in a cast-iron skillet. She looked up as Lillian entered. "Good morning, Miss Brooks. I hope you slept well." "Better than I expected," Lillian admitted. "And please call me Lillian." "Well then, Lillian, have a seat. Breakfast is nearly ready." The housekeeper nodded toward the table, already set with 3 plates. "Xavier's been up since dawn, checking on the horses. He'll be in shortly." As if summoned by his name, Xavier appeared at the door, removing his hat as he entered. He was cleaner than the previous evening, his dark hair damp as if freshly washed, his face clean-shaven. Without the layer of soot and ash, Lillian could see he was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 or so, with a strong jawline and those striking blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "Morning," he greeted them both, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "Hope you slept well, Miss Brooks." "I did, thank you, and please call me Lillian." Xavier nodded, taking a seat at the table. "Lillian, then, Mrs." Landry brought over a platter of bacon, eggs, and biscuits, along with a pot of coffee strong enough that Lillian could smell it from across the table. As they began to eat, Lillian realized how hungry she was. She hadn't eaten since breakfast the previous day, too nervous about the wedding to manage lunch. "I've been thinking," Xavier said after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes, "about your situation." Lillian set down her fork, bracing herself. She had been avoiding thoughts of her predicament, but it couldn't be put off forever. "The depot will take weeks to rebuild," he continued. "And even then, you'll need money for a ticket back east. I could use some help around the ranch." Nothing too strenuous, maybe helping Mrs. Landry with the cooking and mending, tending the kitchen garden. In exchange, you'd have room and board, plus wages enough to save for your ticket home. Lillian stared at him, surprised by the offer. "You would do that for a complete stranger." "You're not exactly a stranger anymore," Xavier pointed out. "Not after what we went through yesterday." Mrs. Landry made a noise of agreement. "And I wouldn't mind the company, to be honest. It gets lonely out here sometimes." Lillian considered the proposal. She had limited options. Her parents were dead, her only sibling a brother who had gone to California during the gold rush and hadn't been heard from in years. She had some distant cousins in Boston who might take her in, but the thought of returning east in disgrace was almost unbearable. "I accept," she said finally, "but only until I have enough for my ticket. I won't impose on your hospitality longer than necessary." Xavier nodded, satisfaction briefly crossing his features. "Fair enough. We can ride into town later today to get whatever else you need from the hotel if you left anything there." "I didn't," Lillian said. "Everything I own is in that trunk." A moment of silence followed her statement, the reality of her situation hanging in the air between them. "Well then, Mrs. Landry said briskly, standing to clear the plates, "We'd best get you acquainted with how things work around here. Xavier, don't you have that fence in the south pasture to mend?" Taking the hint, Xavier rose from the table. "I do indeed. Miss Lillian, I'll see you at supper." After he left Mrs. Landry gave Lillian a knowing look. That man rarely speaks more than 5 words at a time to most people, yet here he is, offering employment and making conversation. You've made quite an impression. I think he just feels sorry for me, Lillian replied, helping to gather the remaining dishes. Xavier Grayson doesn't do anything out of mere pity, Mrs. Landry said firmly. Remember that. The rest of the morning passed quickly as the housekeeper showed Lillian around the ranch house, explaining the daily routine and her expected duties. It was simple work, nothing Lillian hadn't done before in her own home, though she'd had less practice at some tasks than others. What about your brother? Lillian asked Xavier that evening as they sat on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple. Won't he be wondering where you are? Xavier leaned back in his chair, stretching his long legs out before him. I sent a boy from the neighboring ranch into town with a message for Sheriff Mills. Tommy will find me when he finally shows up. Are you close, you and your brother? Used to be, Xavier replied, a note of something like regret in his voice. Tommy's 5 years younger than me. After our parents died, I pretty much raised him, but he's got a wandering spirit, can't seem to stay in one place for long. Last I heard, he was working on a cattle drive-up in Wyoming. Lillian nodded, understanding something of the complicated relationship. My brother William was like that. Always looking for the next big opportunity, the next adventure. And you weren't, she smiled faintly. I thought coming west to marry a man I'd only met twice was adventure enough. Xavier studied her for a moment. You know, most women would be falling apart right now. After what happened yesterday, being jilted, nearly dying in that fire, losing everything. But here you are, calm as can be. Trust me, I'm not as composed as I appear, Lillian admitted. But falling apart won't solve anything. My father always said that when disaster strikes, you don't look back at what you've lost, you look ahead to what you can salvage. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was. Lillian gazed out at the fading light. He would have liked this place, I think. He always said the East was too crowded, too concerned with appearances. He wanted to move west, but my mother was afraid of the wilderness. Xavier was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you think you'll come back, once you're back east, I mean? The question caught Lillian off guard. I don't know, she answered honestly. I haven't thought that far ahead yet. Fair enough, Xavier said, rising from his chair. It's getting late and I start early. Good night, Lillian. Good night, Xavier, she replied, watching as he disappeared into the house. Left alone with her thoughts, Lillian contemplated her strange new circumstances. 24 hours ago, she'd been prepared to become Mrs. Theodore Whitmore, the wife of a respected merchant. Now she was essentially a hired hand on an isolated ranch, working for a man she barely knew. Yet there was something about this place that called to her: the vast open spaces, the honesty of the work, the way the stars seemed close enough to touch in the clear night sky. Perhaps her father had been right about the West after all. With a small smile, Lillian rose and went inside, leaving the porch empty save for the soft chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lonely coyote. Days turned into weeks as Lillian settled into life at the Grayson Ranch. The work was harder than anything she'd done in Boston, but she found satisfaction in it, in the bread she learned to bake in the wood stove, in the vegetables she helped tend in Mrs. Landry's garden, in the shirts she mended by lamplight in the evenings. Xavier remained something of a mystery. He was unfailingly polite, even kind in his quiet way, but he spent most of his days working from dawn until dusk, tending to the cattle and horses that were the lifeblood of his small ranch. When he was around, he seemed to watch Lillian with a curious intensity, as if trying to solve a puzzle. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Lillian was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she noticed Xavier by the corral, working with a young horse. Fascinated, she paused to watch as he moved with remarkable patience, speaking softly to the nervous animal as he gradually introduced it to the saddle blanket. He has a way with them, Mrs. Landry said, appearing beside Lillian with a basket of wet sheets. Always has. It's why he's got the best horses in the territory, even if he doesn't have as many as some of the bigger ranches. Lillian nodded, observing the gentle firmness with which Xavier handled the horse. He's very patient. Had to be, raising Tommy after their parents died, Mrs. Landry replied, hanging a sheet on the line. That boy was wilder than any Mustang. It was Xavier who kept him in school, who made sure he learned right from wrong. How long have you known them? Since they were boys. I worked for their parents before the influenza took them, both in '62, Mrs. Landry sighed, her weathered hands smoothing the wet fabric. Xavier was just 17, Tommy 12. Everyone said Xavier should send the boy to relatives back east, that he was too young to take on such responsibility, but he wouldn't hear of it, said family stays together. Lillian watched as the young horse finally accepted the blanket on its back, nickering softly as Xavier stroked its neck in reward. He must have given up a lot. More than most know, Mrs. Landry agreed. He had plans to attend university in Denver, was even accepted with a scholarship. But after his parents died, he sold their house in town and bought this land instead. Said Tommy needed stability, not to be uprooted again. Something in the older woman's tone made Lillian glance over. You sound like you think he made the wrong choice. Oh, not wrong, never that. Xavier's not a man to make wrong choices, but sometimes I wonder if he's ever done anything just for himself, not out of duty to others. The conversation gave Lillian much to think about as she finished hanging the laundry. Looking at Xavier in a new light, she began to understand the quiet strength that defined him, not just physical strength, though he had that in abundance, but a moral fortitude that had shaped his entire life. Later that afternoon, Xavier approached her as she was gathering eggs from the chicken coop. Lillian, I need to ride into town for supplies tomorrow. Thought you might like to come along. It would give you a chance to see more of the territory. She smiled, genuinely pleased by the invitation. I'd like that very much, thank you. We'll leave after breakfast, he said with a nod, then hesitated as if wanting to say more. Instead, he simply touched the brim of his hat and turned to go. Xavier, she called after him, making a sudden decision. Wait. He paused, looking back at her questioningly. I've been keeping track of my wages, Lillian said, and I believe I now have enough for a ticket back east. Something flickered in his eyes, disappointment perhaps, but was quickly masked. I see. Well, we can check the train schedule while we're in town tomorrow. That's not what I meant, she continued hurriedly. I was going to ask, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to stay on a bit longer. This time there was no mistaking the relief in his expression. You're welcome to stay as long as you'd like, Lillian. The ranch is better with you here. The simple statement warmed her more than she expected. Thank you, I've grown fond of this place. Their eyes met for a moment, and Lillian felt an unexpected flutter in her chest. Before either could speak again, however, they were interrupted by the sound of an approaching rider. Xavier turned, shading his eyes against the late afternoon sun. Well, I'll be damned, he murmured. It's Tommy. The rider approached at a gallop, raising dust from the dry road. As he drew closer, Lillian could make out a young man with the same dark hair as Xavier, though his features were more boyish, his build leaner. Bet you thought I wasn't coming, Tommy called as he reined his horse to a stop. He swung down from the saddle with easy grace, a wide grin splitting his face as he embraced his brother. Sorry I'm late, got held up in Cheyenne. You're always late, Xavier replied, though his tone held affection rather than reproach. It's good to see you, Tommy. Tommy's attention shifted to Lillian, his grin turning curious. And who might this lovely lady be? Lillian Brooks, Xavier said before she could answer. She's been helping out around the ranch. Lillian, this is my brother, Thomas Grayson. Just Tommy, please, the younger Grayson said, sweeping off his hat and offering a small bow that seemed half serious, half mocking. Charmed to make your acquaintance, Miss Brooks. Likewise, Lillian replied, instantly noting the differences between the brothers. Where Xavier was steady and thoughtful, Tommy practically vibrated with restless energy. Miss Brooks was caught in the depot fire, Xavier explained. The one I mentioned in my letter. Tommy's expression sobered slightly. Ah, yes, terrible business that. Glad to see you survived unscathed, Miss Brooks. His serious demeanor lasted only a moment before the grin returned. Though I'm sure my brother had something to do with your rescue, Always was a hero, this one. Xavier rolled his eyes. Come on inside, Mrs. Landry will want to know you're here. As they walked toward the house, Tommy leaned close to Lillian. So, how'd my brother convince a proper Boston lady to work on a ranch in the middle of nowhere? Must have used all his considerable charm. I was in need of employment, and your brother kindly offered, Lillian replied simply. Tommy laughed. That sounds like X always taking in strays. Seeing her expression, he quickly added, No offense meant, Miss Brooks. I'm just surprised to find a lady like yourself out here. X usually avoids female company like it's smallpox. Before Lillian could respond, they reached the house, where Mrs. Landry was already waiting on the porch, hands on her hips. Thomas Grayson, you're 3 weeks late and you look like you haven't had a decent meal in twice that time, the housekeeper scolded, though her eyes were bright with affection. Missed you too, Mrs. L., Tommy said, bounding up the steps to give her a quick hug, and I'm starving. Please tell me you've made your famous venison stew recently. As a matter of fact, that's what's for supper, Mrs. Landry replied, unable to maintain her stern expression in the face of Tommy's charm. Now go get cleaned up. You smell like you've been sleeping in a stable. Only half the time, Tommy assured her with a wink, disappearing into the house. Xavier sighed, watching his brother go. He hasn't changed a bit, he seems. Lively, Lillian offered diplomatically. That's one word for it, Xavier agreed with a small smile. He'll liven things up around here, that's for certain. Supper that evening was unlike any meal since Lillian's arrival at the ranch. Tommy dominated the conversation, regaling them with tales of his travels, some so outlandish that Lillian suspected they were greatly exaggerated, if not entirely fabricated. Yet his storytelling was so engaging, his manner so charming, that she found herself laughing along with everyone else. So there I was, Tommy was saying, gesturing wildly with his fork, trapped between the bear and the cliff edge with nothing but a pocket knife and my wits. And what happened then? Mrs. Landry asked, enthralled despite herself. Well, I remembered what Pa always said about bears, they can't climb down trees, only up. So I jumped off the cliff, Xavier snorted. Into what? Certain death. Into a pine tree growing out from the cliff face below, Tommy clarified, as if this were a perfectly reasonable course of action. Climbed down safe as can be, while the old bear just growled from above. Lillian caught Xavier's eye across the table, and they shared a look of amused skepticism. The brief moment of connection sent an unexpected warmth through her. After dinner, the brothers sat on the porch with glasses of whiskey, catching up on family matters. Lillian excused herself to help Mrs. Landry with the dishes, though she could hear their voices drifting through the open window. She's pretty, X, she heard Tommy say. Smart too, from what I can tell. You sweet on her. Xavier's reply was too low to make out, but whatever he said caused Tommy to laugh loudly. Oh, come on, brother. I know you better than that. The way you look at her when you think no one's watching, I haven't seen you look at anyone like that since Sarah Mitchell in school. That was different, Xavier responded, his voice clearer now, and Lillian's situation is complicated. She's been through a lot. All the more reason to show her some kindness beyond just giving her a job, Tommy insisted. Take her into town tomorrow, buy her something pretty, show her there's more to life out here than just work, Mrs. Landry nudged Lillian, who realized she'd been standing still, straining to hear the conversation. Men, the housekeeper said with a knowing shake of her head, always thinking they need to be so mysterious about their feelings. Lillian blushed, returning her attention to the dish she was drying. I don't know what you mean. Oh, I think you do, Mrs. Landry replied, her tone gentle. Xavier may not be as showy as his brother, but his feelings run deeper for it. I've never seen him as content as he's been since you arrived. He's just being kind, Lillian protested, though her heart beat a little faster at the older woman's words. Xavier Grayson is many things honorable, hardworking, stubborn as a mule sometimes, but he's not a man to act from simple kindness where his heart is concerned, Mrs. Landry said firmly. Mark my words. Later that night, lying in bed and listening to the unfamiliar sound of male laughter from the main room, Lillian found herself contemplating her feelings. She had come west for love, expecting to find it with Theodore. Instead, she had found betrayal. But here, in this remote ranch house with its simple comforts and honest work, she had also found something unexpected, a sense of belonging, and perhaps the beginnings of something that felt remarkably like love. The thought should have frightened her after her recent heartbreak, but somehow it didn't. Whatever was growing between her and Xavier felt nothing like her courtship with Theodore. It was quieter, less dramatic, but somehow more solid, built on mutual respect rather than romantic notions. As sleep finally claimed her, Lillian realized that for the first time since the disaster at the depot, she was no longer thinking of her future in terms of returning east. Instead, she was beginning to imagine a life here, under the vast western sky, with a quiet cowboy who had walked through fire to save her. The trip to town the next day was more enjoyable than Lillian had anticipated. Xavier drove the wagon while she sat beside him and addressed Mrs. Landry had altered to fit her better. Tommy had elected to stay behind, claiming exhaustion from his travels, though Lillian suspected he was giving his brother time alone with her. Parowan was a small but growing settlement, with a main street lined by a general store, a small hotel, a saloon, and various other businesses. The blackened ruins of the depot stood at the edge of town, construction already underway to rebuild it. As they tied up the horses outside the general store, several townspeople greeted Xavier with obvious respect. A few cast curious glances at Lillian, clearly wondering about her presence at his side. "Folks around here don't get much excitement," Xavier explained as he helped her down from the wagon. A fire at the depot and a jilted bride in the same day was probably the most interesting thing to happen in Parowan since the mining company tried to buy up the whole valley. And now those same townspeople are seeing the jilted bride with the reclusive rancher, Lillian observed with a small smile. "We'll be giving them even more to talk about." Xavier's lips quirked up at the corners. "Let them talk, it's a free country." Inside the general store, Lillian helped Xavier select the supplies they needed while trying to ignore the whispers that followed them. She was examining a bolt of calico when the storekeeper's wife approached. "Miss Brooks, isn't it?" The woman asked, her expression a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. "I'm Mrs. Henderson. My husband and I own the store. I was at the depot that day, for your wedding. Such a terrible thing, what happened." "Yes, it was," Lillian agreed politely, unsure how much the woman knew about Theodore's betrayal. "And now you're staying out at the Grayson ranch," Mrs. Henderson continued, her eyes darting between Lillian and Xavier, who was selecting coffee beans at the counter. "I am. Mr. Grayson kindly offered me employment after the fire." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows rose. "Employment? Is that what they're calling it these days?" The implication was clear, and Lillian felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from anger. "Yes, Mrs. Henderson, employment. I help with the cooking and housework in exchange for room, board, and wages." "Of course, dear," the woman replied, her tone making it clear she didn't believe a word of it. "It's just, well, people talk, you understand. A single woman living alone with a man, no matter how respectable he might be." "Mrs. Landry also lives at the ranch," Lillian interrupted coolly. "As does Mr. Grayson's brother. I assure you my reputation is quite intact." Before Mrs. Henderson could respond, Xavier appeared at Lillian's side, his expression making it clear he'd overheard at least part of the conversation. "Is everything all right here?" "Perfectly fine," Lillian assured him, giving Mrs. Henderson a pointed look. Mrs. Henderson was just explaining the local customs regarding female employment. Xavier's eyes narrowed slightly, but his voice remained even. "Mrs. Henderson, always a pleasure." He turned to Lillian. "I've got everything we need. Shall we move on?" As they left the store, Lillian could feel Mrs. Henderson's gaze burning into her back. She walked tall, refusing to show any sign that the woman's insinuations had bothered her. "I'm sorry about that," Xavier said once they were outside. "Small towns can be judgmental." "It's not your fault," Lillian replied. "I'm used to people making assumptions." Still, she had no right. Xavier frowned, then seemed to make a decision. "Come on, there's somewhere I want to show you before we head back." They stored their purchases in the wagon, then Xavier led her down the main street, past the saloon and the blacksmith shop, to a small building set apart from the others. A wooden sign over the door read Parowan Territorial Library and Telegraph Office. A library. Lillian asked, pleasantly surprised. It's small, but they have a decent collection, Xavier explained, holding the door open for her. I thought you might like to borrow some books. The ranch can get dull in the evenings. Inside, the single room was lined with bookshelves, with a small desk at one end where a bespectacled man sat beside a telegraph machine. The librarian looked up as they entered, his face breaking into a smile. Xavier Grayson, as I live and breathe, it's been months since you've darkened my door. Been busy with the spring calving, Mr. Patterson, Xavier replied, shaking the man's hand. This is Miss Lillian Brooks. She's staying at the ranch for a while and would appreciate access to your books. Mr. Patterson beamed at Lillian. Any friend of Xavier's is welcome here. Please browse to your heart's content. While Lillian explored the shelves, Xavier and the librarian fell into conversation about local matters. She soon found herself lost in the joy of discovery, running her fingers along the spines of books she hadn't read before. By the time she returned to the desk, she had selected 3 volumes, a novel by Charles Dickens, a collection of poetry by Emily Dickinson, and a practical guide to gardening in the Western Territories. Excellent choices, Mr. Patterson approved, noting down the titles in his ledger. Xavier always did have friends with good taste in literature. As they walked back toward the wagon, Lillian hugged the books to her chest, genuinely touched by Xavier's thoughtfulness. Thank you for this. It means a lot. I remember you mentioned you enjoyed reading, he said with a shrug as if it were nothing special. And I figured you might be tired of the few books we have at the ranch. It wasn't just the books, Lillian clarified. It was that you thought of what might make me happy here. Xavier glanced at her, something warm in his eyes. Your happiness is important to me, Lillian. The simple statement, spoken so matter-of-factly, affected her more deeply than any flowery declaration Theodore had ever made. Before she could respond, however, a commotion down the street caught their attention. A man was stumbling out of the saloon, clearly drunk despite the early hour. As he lurched onto the boardwalk, Lillian froze, the books nearly slipping from her suddenly nerveless fingers. It was Theodore Whitmore. He looked terrible unshaven, his once immaculate suit rumpled and stained, his eyes bloodshot. He hadn't seen them yet, as he was busy arguing with the saloon keeper who had followed him out. You can't throw me out. Theodore slurred, waving an unsteady finger at the larger man. Do you know who I am? I know you're a man who can't pay his tab, the saloon keeper replied firmly. And I know you're not welcome back until you do. Xavier had noticed Lillian's reaction and followed her gaze. His expression hardened as he recognized Theodore. Do you want to leave? He asked quietly. We can go back to the ranch right now. Lillian considered it, tempted to flee to avoid the confrontation, but something in her rebelled at the thought of hiding. No, she said, squaring her shoulders. I won't run away. Before Xavier could respond, Theodore looked up and spotted them. His bleary eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with a mixture of guilt and defiance. Lillian, he called, starting toward them with an unsteady gait. Is that really you? Lillian felt Xavier tense beside her, his hand moving slightly as if to step in front of her protectively. She appreciated the gesture but laid a gentle hand on his arm. It's all right, she murmured. I can handle this. Theodore stopped a few feet away, swaying slightly as he looked her up and down. Well, didn't expect to see you still in town. Thought you'd have run back east by now. As you can see, I'm still here, Lillian replied calmly, though her heart was racing. What happened to you, Theodore? What happened to the woman you left with? A flash of something shame perhaps crossed Theodore's face before being replaced by a sneer. Clara, she took what was left of my money and disappeared in Sacramento. He barked a harsh laugh. Poetic justice, I suppose. So you came back to Parowan. Had nowhere else to go, Theodore admitted, his shoulders slumping. Though it seems I'm not welcome here anymore. My creditors seized the mercantile, the hotel won't give me a room. His gaze sharpened as he finally seemed to register Xavier's presence. And who's this? Found yourself a new protector already, Lillian. My, how quickly your affections transfer. Xavier stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. I suggest you watch your tongue, Whitmore. Theodore squinted at him, recognition dawning. Grayson, isn't it, the rancher from outside town? His lips curled into a mocking smile. Taking my leftovers, are you? The crude comment had barely left his mouth when Xavier's fist connected with his jaw, sending Theodore sprawling into the dirt. The few townspeople on the street stopped to watch the confrontation, but no one moved to intervene. Xavier, Lillian gasped, more surprised than upset. She had never seen the normally calm rancher lose his temper before. Xavier flexed his hand, looking down at the groaning form of Theodore with cold disdain. Miss Brooks is a lady deserving of respect, he said evenly. Something you clearly know nothing about. Theodore pushed himself up on one elbow, blood trickling from his split lip. You'll regret that, Grayson. I doubt it, Xavier replied, turning his back on the man to offer his arm to Lillian. Shall we go? Lillian took his arm, but paused to look down at her former fiancé. I hope you find your way, Theodore. I truly do, but I'm glad I didn't marry you. It would have been the biggest mistake of my life. With that, she allowed Xavier to escort her to the wagon, conscious of the stares from the townspeople they passed. Neither spoke until they were well outside town, the horses trotting steadily toward home. I apologize for losing my temper, Xavier finally said, his grip tight on the reins. That was uncharacteristic of me. There's no need to apologize, Lillian assured him. Though I admit I was surprised, you always seem so composed. A faint smile touched his lips. Even the most patient man has his limits, and hearing him speak of you that way. Xavier shook his head. It wasn't something I could let pass. Lillian studied his profile, seeing the firm set of his jaw, the intensity in his eyes. Thank you, she said softly, not just for defending me, but for being the kind of man who would. Xavier glanced at her, holding her gaze for a moment before returning his attention to the road. You deserve better than what he did to you, Lillian. You deserve someone who sees your worth, who would walk through fire for you. He paused, then added quietly, literally, if necessary. The reference to their first meeting, to his rescue of her from the burning depot, made Lillian's heart skip a beat. There was something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, that suggested he wasn't speaking hypothetically, that perhaps he was offering to be that someone. The realization both thrilled and frightened her. It had been only a month since Theodore's betrayal, since the life she had planned had gone up in flames along with the depot roof. Was she ready to open her heart again so soon? Yet as they continued toward the ranch, the horses kicking up dust in the golden afternoon light, Lillian found herself wondering if perhaps some fires weren't destructive at all, but rather forged something stronger from what had been there before. Summer gave way to fall, bringing cooler temperatures and changing the landscape around the ranch to rich golds and reds. Tommy stayed longer than usual, helping with the harvest and the preparations for winter. His presence added a liveliness to the household that everyone appreciated, though Lillian sometimes caught Xavier watching his brother with a mixture of affection and concern. Is something wrong between you and Tommy? She asked one evening as they sat on the porch, shelling peas from the garden. Inside, they could hear Tommy regaling Mrs. Landry with yet another improbable tale of his adventures. Xavier's hands paused in their work. What makes you ask that? Just a feeling, Lillian replied. Sometimes when he's talking, you get this look. Tommy's always been a dreamer, Xavier said after a moment. Always looking for the next big opportunity, the next adventure, never content to stay in one place. And that bothers you, not exactly, Xavier sighed, setting aside the bowl of peas. I worry about him. The life he leads, it's exciting, but it's not stable. No roots, no real connections. That takes a toll on a man eventually. Lillian nodded, understanding. You want him to be happy. I want him to find what really matters, Xavier corrected gently, before it's too late. There was something in his tone that made Lillian wonder if he was thinking of more than just Tommy's lifestyle. Before she could pursue it, however, the man himself burst onto the porch. There you two are, Tommy exclaimed, dropping into a chair beside them. Planning your wedding without me. Lillian nearly dropped the pod she was shelling, while Xavier gave his brother a warning look. "We're just talking, Tommy." "Of course you are," Tommy replied with an exaggerated wink. "Just like you were just talking yesterday by the creek and the day before that in the barn." "Did you need something?" Xavier asked pointedly, clearly trying to change the subject. Tommy's expression shifted to something more serious. "Actually, yes, I got a telegram in town today. The cattle drive I was supposed to join next month, it's been moved up. They want me in Cheyenne in a week." Xavier's face fell slightly, though he quickly masked it. "I see. Well, we knew you'd be moving on eventually." "You could come with me," Tommy suggested, leaning forward. "Like old times, remember when we worked that drive together from Texas? The money's good and the outfit's respectable." "I have responsibilities here," Xavier replied, shaking his head. The ranch would be fine for a few months," Tommy insisted. "Mrs. Landry could manage things, and I'm sure Lillian would help. Wouldn't you, Lillian?" Put on the spot, Lillian hesitated. "I. Of course I would help, but it's not my place to say what Xavier should do." Tommy gave her a knowing look. "But you'd miss him if he left, wouldn't you?" "Tommy," Xavier warned, his voice low. "What? I'm just saying what everyone can see, brother. You two have been dancing around each other for months now. It's driving Mrs. Landry to distraction." Lillian felt her cheeks flush, unable to deny the truth in Tommy's words. Since their encounter with Theodore in town, something had shifted between her and Xavier. There had been moments, a lingering touch while passing a plate at dinner, a shared smile over some private joke, a long look across the room when they thought no one was watching that suggested they were moving toward something more than friendship. Yet neither had taken the final step to acknowledge their feelings openly. "I should check on the bread," Lillian said, rising abruptly. "It must be about done." She retreated into the house, her heart pounding. Behind her, she could hear the brothers' voices, Xavier's low and irritated, Tommy's cajoling and unapologetic. In the kitchen, Mrs. Landry gave her a sympathetic look. "Tommy putting his foot in it again. He has a talent for it," Lillian agreed, opening the oven to check the loaves inside. The rich aroma of fresh bread filled the kitchen, momentarily distracting her from her embarrassment. "That boy never could understand the value of patience," Mrs. Landry said, shaking her head. "Always rushing headlong into everything. Xavier's the opposite, sometimes too careful for his own good." Lillian removed the bread from the oven, setting the hot pans on the stovetop to cool. "I don't want to come between them. They're family." "Oh, honey," Mrs. Landry said gently, "you're not coming between anything. Those boys love each other, but they're as different as night and day." "Always have been." She patted Lillian's hand. "And for what it's worth, I think you're exactly what Xavier needs, someone who appreciates his steadiness but isn't afraid to bring a little light into his life." The older woman's words stayed with Lillian through dinner and into the evening, as the four of them sat around the fire, Tommy entertaining them with stories of his travels. Xavier was quieter than usual, his eyes often straying to Lillian when he thought she wasn't looking. Later, after Tommy and Mrs. Landry had retired for the night, Lillian found herself alone with Xavier in the main room. He stood by the window, looking out at the moonlit landscape, his expression thoughtful. "Are you considering it?" she asked, joining him. "Going with Tommy on the cattle drive?" Xavier glanced at her, surprise evident in his features. "No, my place is here, but you want to," Lillian pressed gently. "I can see it in your eyes when he talks about it, the open trail, the adventure." "Maybe a part of me does," Xavier admitted. "But wanting something doesn't make it the right choice," Lillian nodded, understanding all too well. "I wanted to marry Theodore. I thought it was what I was supposed to do, leave Boston, start a new life in the West as a respectable merchant's wife." She smiled faintly. Life had other plans. "Are you sorry about that?" Xavier asked, his voice low. About how things turned out, the question hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning beyond the simple words. Lillian knew her answer would change everything. "No," she said softly, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm not sorry at all." Xavier's expression softened, hope kindling in his eyes. He turned fully to face her, close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. Lillian, a crash from the kitchen interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They both turned to find Tommy standing amidst the remains of a broken lamp, looking sheepish. "Sorry," he said, not sounding particularly sorry at all. "Just came to get some water, don't mind me." Xavier closed his eyes briefly, as if praying for patience. "It's late, Tommy, you should be in bed." "Right you are, brother," Tommy agreed cheerfully, filling a glass with water and backing toward the hallway. "Don't let me interrupt. Carry on with whatever you two were discussing so intently." After he disappeared, Xavier sighed, the moment broken. "I should clean that up before someone steps on the glass." "I'll help," Lillian offered, though she couldn't help feeling disappointed at the interruption. As they knelt together, carefully picking up the shards of the broken lamp, their hands occasionally brushed against each other. Each touch sent a small thrill through Lillian, a reminder of the unspoken feelings between them. "About what I was going to say," Xavier began, his voice low. "Yes," Lillian prompted when he paused. He met her eyes, his own full of an emotion that made her breath catch. "It can wait until tomorrow, when we might have more privacy." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward the hallway where Tommy had disappeared. "Perhaps we could ride out to the south pasture after breakfast. There's something there I'd like to show you." Lillian nodded, understanding his desire for a moment away from the watchful eyes and listening ears of the household. "I'd like that very much." As they finished cleaning up the broken lamp, an anticipation began to build in Lillian's chest, a sense that tomorrow might bring a new beginning. A chance to finally acknowledge the feelings that had been growing between them through the summer and into the fall. That night, as she lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling around her, Lillian realized that she no longer thought of Boston as home. Somewhere in the month since the fire at the depot, this place with its vast skies, its honest work, and most of all, its quiet cowboy with the steady hands and watchful eyes had become where she belonged. Morning dawned clear and cool, with the promise of a beautiful fall day ahead. Lillian dressed with extra care, selecting a riding skirt and jacket that Mrs. Landry had helped her alter from one of her Boston dresses. Her heart fluttered with nervous excitement as she pinned her hair, wondering what Xavier wanted to show her in the south pasture and what he had been about to say last night before Tommy's interruption. When she emerged from her room, she found Tommy alone at the breakfast table, a mischievous smile playing about his lips. "Good morning, Lillian. You look especially lovely today." "Thank you, Tommy," she replied, glancing around. "Where is everyone, Mrs. Landry's gathering eggs, and Xavier rode out at dawn to check on a sick calf." Tommy buttered a slice of bread, watching her reaction. "He asked me to tell you he'd meet you at the barn at 10, if that still suits." Lillian nodded, trying to hide her disappointment at not seeing Xavier at breakfast. "Yes, that's fine. You know," Tommy said casually, "my brother's not much for words, but when he does speak, he means what he says." "I've noticed that about him," Lillian agreed, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "He's also the most honorable man I've ever known, to a fault sometimes." Tommy leaned forward, suddenly serious. "What I'm saying is, whatever he tells you today, you can trust it. It won't be pretty words or empty promises." Surprised by this earnest side of the usually joking younger Grayson, Lillian asked, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've watched him these past months, the way he looks at you when you're not watching, the way he smiles more than he has in years." Tommy shrugged, a touch of wistfulness in his expression. "My brother deserves to be happy, and I think you might be the one to make him so." Touched by Tommy's unexpected depth of feeling, Lillian reached across the table to squeeze his hand. "Thank you, Tommy, that means a lot." At 10 o'clock, Lillian made her way to the barn to find Xavier already there, saddling 2 horses. He looked up as she entered, his face lighting with a smile that made her heart skip. "Good morning," he greeted her, his voice warm. "Sleep well?" "Well enough," she replied, returning his smile. "Though I was looking forward to today," a pleased expression crossed his features. "So was I." He patted the neck of the smaller of the 2 horses, a gentle mare named Daisy that Lillian had learned to ride on over the summer. "She's ready for you. We'll take it slow, no need to rush." The ride to the south pasture took them through some of the most beautiful parts of the ranch, across a shallow stream where aspens were turning golden, through a meadow still green despite the advancing season, and finally up a gentle rise that offered a view of the surrounding countryside. Xavier rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out features of the land or sharing stories about its history. Finally, they crested a hill, and Xavier reined his horse to a stop. Below them stretched a small valley, sheltered by hills on 3 sides and bordered by the stream on the 4th. A grove of ancient oak trees stood in the center, their massive branches spreading wide. "It's beautiful," Lillian said, taking in the peaceful scene. "My father brought me here when I was a boy," Xavier explained, dismounting and coming to help her down from her horse. "Said it was the heart of the ranch, though it's not on any map or deed." He led her down into the valley toward the oak grove. As they approached, Lillian noticed something she hadn't been able to see from the hilltop: a small cabin, weathered but sturdy, nestled among the trees. "What is this place?" she asked as they drew closer. "My grandfather built it when he first came to this land," Xavier replied, a note of pride in his voice. "Before the main house, before anything else, it was where my father was born." He opened the door, which creaked slightly on its hinges, and gestured for her to enter. Inside, the cabin was simple but charming: a single room with a stone fireplace, a small table with chairs, a bed frame against one wall. Dust covered everything, and spider webs stretched in the corners, but Lillian could see the bones of what had once been a cozy home. "No one's lived here for years," Xavier explained, moving to open the shutters, letting in shafts of sunlight that illuminated dancing dust motes. "After my grandparents built the main house, it became a place for storage, then gradually was forgotten." "Why show it to me now?" Lillian asked, curious about his purpose in bringing her here. Xavier turned to face her, sunlight streaming in behind him. "Because I've been thinking about restoring it, making it a home again." Something in his tone made her heart beat faster. "For whom?" He took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "That depends on you, Lillian, on me," she echoed, hardly daring to hope what he might mean. "I'm not a man of fancy words," Xavier said, his voice low and earnest. "I can't offer you the kind of life Theodore promised: no fine house in town, no social position, but I can offer you this ranch, this valley." He took a deep breath. "And myself, if you'll have me." Lillian's breath caught. "Xavier, are you asking?" "I'm asking if you'll marry me," he confirmed, reaching for her hand. "I know it hasn't been long since. Everything happened, and if you need more time, I understand, but I wanted you to know how I feel, that I love you, Lillian Brooks. Have since the moment I saw you standing in that burning depot, refusing to leave without your trunk." Tears welled in Lillian's eyes, not from sadness but from a joy so overwhelming it almost hurt. "You loved me even then, when I was in a wedding dress meant for another man." "Maybe not love, not right away," Xavier admitted with a small smile. "But something pulled me to you, made me want to protect you, to know you, and every day since, that feeling has only grown stronger." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small object that glinted in the sunlight: a ring, simple but beautiful, with a small diamond set in silver. "It was my mother's," he explained, holding it out to her. "I'd be honored if you'd wear it." Lillian looked from the ring to Xavier's face, seeing the hope and vulnerability there. This was nothing like Theodore's proposal, which had been planned to the last detail, delivered in a crowded restaurant in Boston with a speech that had sounded rehearsed. This was real, honest, straight from Xavier's heart to hers. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Grayson." His face broke into a smile more brilliant than any she'd seen from him before. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her gently into his arms. "May I kiss you?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. In answer, Lillian rose on tiptoes, bringing her lips to his. The kiss was tender at first, almost hesitant, but quickly deepened as months of unspoken longing found expression at last. His arms tightened around her waist, drawing her closer, while her hands moved to his shoulders, then to the back of his neck. When they finally broke apart, both a little breathless, Xavier rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that for a very long time." "So have I," Lillian admitted, smiling up at him, "though I wasn't sure if you felt the same way." Xavier chuckled, the sound rumbling pleasantly in his chest. According to Tommy and Mrs. Landry, I've been embarrassingly obvious about my feelings. Well, you were subtle enough that I wasn't entirely certain, Lillian teased, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, though I hoped. They spent the rest of the morning in the cabin, sitting together on a bench outside the door, planning their future. Xavier spoke of his ideas for restoring the small house, making it their home while Tommy took over the main ranch house. Of course, we'll need to be married first, Xavier said, his thumb gently rubbing the back of her hand where his mother's ring now rested. I was thinking next month, if that's not too soon. The circuit preacher comes through Parowan the first Sunday. Next month sounds perfect, Lillian agreed. Though I have to warn you, I don't have the best luck with weddings. Xavier laughed, pulling her closer against his side. Well, this one won't be at the depot, so we're already ahead of the game. And I know for certain the groom will show up, Lillian added, leaning into his embrace. Since he's currently sitting right beside me. They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, both feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in the world. The landscape looked the same: the golden aspens, the distant mountains, the clear blue sky, but everything felt different, imbued with new meaning and promise. As they approached the ranch house, Lillian spotted Tommy and Mrs. Landry waiting on the porch, watching their return with undisguised curiosity. She glanced at Xavier, a question in her eyes. Might as well tell them now, he said with a smile. They'll figure it out soon enough anyway. Tommy was the first to notice the ring on Lillian's finger as Xavier helped her dismount. His face split into a wide grin. Well, looks like my big brother finally found his courage. Mrs. Landry hurried forward, embracing first Lillian, then Xavier. It's about time, she declared, wiping happy tears from her eyes. I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar together to make something happen. Xavier laughed, his arm slipping naturally around Lillian's waist. Your meddling wasn't necessary, Mrs. Landry. Though I appreciate the sentiment. When's the wedding? Tommy asked, slapping his brother on the shoulder. First Sunday next month, Xavier replied, if that suits everyone. Perfect, Mrs. Landry nodded approvingly. That gives us just enough time to prepare. We'll need to clean the house top to bottom, of course, and Lillian will need a proper dress. She eyed Lillian speculatively. Nothing too fancy, mind, just something pretty that isn't associated with, well, you know. I'd like that, Lillian agreed, touched by the older woman's thoughtfulness. Something simple but new. That evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the conversation was filled with wedding plans and good-natured teasing. Tommy proposed a toast to the couple, for once sincere rather than joking. To my brother, the steadiest man I know, and to Lillian, the woman brave enough to take him on. May your lives together be long and happy. As glasses clinked, Lillian caught Xavier's eye across the table. The love she saw there, open and unguarded, filled her with a happiness she'd never expected to find after the disaster at the depot. In the moment when the roof caught fire above her, she had thought her life was ending. Instead, it had been just beginning. The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the first Sunday in November bringing with it a sharpness to the air that hinted at the winter to come. In her room at the ranch house, Lillian sat before the small mirror as Mrs. Landry pinned white flowers into her upswept hair. There, the housekeeper said, stepping back to admire her work. Simple but elegant, just as you wanted. Lillian studied her reflection, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the formal, overly decorated bride who had waited in vain at the Parowan depot months earlier. In her place was a woman whose face had been kissed by the western sun, whose eyes held a quiet confidence, whose smile came easily and genuinely. The dress Mrs. Landry had helped her make was nothing like her previous wedding gown. Where that had been a confection of lace and beading, this was a simple creation of cream-colored silk, with a fitted bodice and gracefully flowing skirt. No veil obscured her face this time, only the flowers in her hair and a ribbon of satin around her throat, from which hung a small silver locket Xavier had given her as a wedding gift. I've never seen a prettier bride, Mrs. Landry declared, her eyes suspiciously bright. Xavier won't know what hit him. A knock at the door preceded Tommy's voice. Ladies, it's time. The preacher's here, and my brother looks like he might wear a hole in the floor with his pacing. Lillian took a deep breath, gathering her bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers and garden roses. I'm ready. The ceremony was to take place in the main room of the ranch house, which had been transformed for the occasion. Furniture had been moved aside to create a small aisle, chairs brought in for the few guests' neighbors from nearby ranches, Mr. Patterson from the library, Sheriff Mills and his wife. At the far end, before the stone fireplace where a cheerful fire burned, stood Preacher Williams with Xavier beside him. As Lillian entered on Tommy's arm, he had insisted on giving her away, declaring it his brotherly duty she had eyes only for Xavier. He stood tall and straight, more formally dressed than she had ever seen him in a new suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. But it was his expression that caught her heart, the look of wonder and love as he watched her approach, as if he couldn't quite believe his good fortune. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, their vows spoken clearly before the small gathering of friends who had become, in many ways, Lillian's new family. When Xavier slipped the simple gold band onto her finger to join his mother's ring, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. I now pronounce you man and wife, Preacher Williams declared. Xavier, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle but full of promise, Xavier's hand coming up to cup her cheek as his lips met hers. Around them, their guests broke into applause and cheers, Tommy's voice the loudest among them. The celebration that followed was lively and warm, with food prepared by Mrs. Landry and the neighboring ranch wives, music provided by a fiddler from town, and plenty of laughter. As evening approached, Xavier found Lillian sitting by the fire, taking a moment of quiet amidst the festivities. Mrs. Grayson, he said, offering his hand. May I have this dance? Lillian smiled up at him, the name still new and wonderful to her ears. You may, Mr. Grayson. As they moved together to the slow melody, Xavier whispered in her ear, happy. More than I ever thought possible, she replied truthfully. And you, I have everything I could ever want, he said, his arm tightening around her waist, right here in my arms. Later, after their guests had departed and Tommy had tactfully announced he would be staying in town for the night, Xavier led Lillian toward the small cabin in the south pasture. They had spent every free moment of the past month restoring it, making it habitable again, fixing the roof, replacing broken windows, sanding and polishing the old wooden floors. Now, as they approached on horseback under a canopy of stars, Lillian could see the warm glow of lamps in the windows, welcoming them home. Xavier lifted her down from her horse, but instead of letting her walk to the door, he swept her into his arms. I believe this is traditional, he said with a smile, carrying her across the threshold. Inside, the cabin had been transformed. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a colorful quilt brightened the bed, and flowers filled a vase on the table. A fire crackled in the hearth, warding off the November chill. It's perfect, Lillian said as Xavier set her gently on her feet. Everything is perfect. He turned her to face him, his expression serious despite his smile. I want you to know something, Lillian. That day at the depot when the roof caught fire, I wasn't supposed to be there. I had finished my business in town and was heading back to the ranch when something made me turn around. Lillian tilted her head, curious. What was it? I don't know, Xavier admitted. A feeling, I guess. Like I was needed there. When I saw the smoke, I didn't think twice. He cupped her face in his hands. Now I know why I felt that pull. I was meant to find you, and I was meant to be found, Lillian whispered, rising on tiptoes to kiss him. By you, Xavier Grayson, only you. As the fire burned low in the hearth and the stars wheeled overhead, they began their life together in the little cabin, far from the ashes of the depot where their story had begun. Spring came early the following year, bringing with it new life to the ranch. The cattle Xavier had worried about through the winter were now calving, filling the pastures with wobbly-legged youngsters that raced and played in the warming sunshine. In the garden beside the cabin, Lillian knelt in the soft earth, planting seeds for summer vegetables, her wide-brimmed hat shading her from the strengthening sun. You should be resting, Xavier's voice came from behind her. She turned to see him approaching from the main house, his stride long and purposeful as always. "I'm perfectly fine," she assured him, though she accepted his hand to help her to her feet. "The doctor said moderate activity is good for me." Xavier's gaze dropped to the gentle swell of her belly, visible now beneath her loose dress. His expression softened, as it always did when he was reminded of the child they were expecting in late summer. "Moderate activity doesn't mean kneeling in the dirt for hours," he said, though there was no real scolding in his tone. "Mrs. Landry sent me to tell you lunch is ready. Tommy's back from town with the mail." They walked hand in hand toward the main house, where Tommy had taken up permanent residence after their marriage. Though he still disappeared occasionally for weeks at a time, drawn by the call of adventure, he always returned to the ranch, bringing stories and small gifts from his travels. "Any news from town?" Lillian asked as they crossed the yard. Xavier nodded. "The new depot is finally finished. Train service should resume next week." "That's wonderful," Lillian said sincerely. The town had struggled without regular train service since the fire, relying on infrequent stage coaches and private couriers for mail and supplies. "I should go in to see it when it's open." "Already planning to," Xavier replied with a smile. "Tommy says it's twice as big as the old one, with a proper waiting room and everything." As they entered the house, they found Tommy at the kitchen table, sorting through a stack of envelopes and packages. He looked up with a grin. "Mail call for the Grayson family. Lillian, this one's for you." He handed her a thick envelope bearing a Boston postmark. "From Margaret," Lillian said, recognizing her cousin's handwriting. She had written to her Boston relations after the wedding, explaining her new circumstances. The responses had been mixed, some scandalized that she had married so quickly after being jilted, others relieved that she had found happiness despite her ordeal. "And this," Tommy continued, sliding a small package across the table, "is from me. A little something for my future niece or nephew." Lillian unwrapped the package to find a beautifully carved wooden rattle, the handle smooth and polished to a soft sheen. "Tommy, it's lovely. Did you make this?" "Met a Navajo craftsman on my last trip," Tommy explained, looking pleased with her reaction. "He taught me a few things." Xavier examined the rattle, approval in his eyes. "Fine work, little brother. You've got talent when you choose to use it. Speaking of talent, Mrs. Landry interjected, bringing a steaming pot of stew to the table. "The sheriff's wife told me they're looking for someone to teach at the school come fall. The current teacher is moving to California." She gave Lillian a meaningful look. "With your education, you'd be perfect for it." Lillian considered the idea. She had mentioned to Mrs. Landry once that she had briefly worked as a teacher's assistant in Boston before coming west. "I don't know, with the baby coming. It wouldn't start until September," Mrs. Landry pointed out. "The baby will be nearly 2 months old by then, and it's only 3 days a week." Xavier squeezed her hand under the table. "It's your decision, of course, but if you wanted to do it, we could make it work." The easy support, the assumption that her wishes mattered, still sometimes caught Lillian by surprise. Theodore had spoken often of her future role as his wife, always in terms of what he expected from her. Xavier, in contrast, consistently treated her as a partner, her desires as valid as his own. "I'll think about it," she promised, touched by their confidence in her. After lunch, as Tommy and Xavier discussed plans for the summer cattle drive, Lillian slipped outside to read her cousin's letter. Settling into a chair on the porch, she broke the seal and unfolded the pages, eager for news from Boston. Margaret's letter was full of family updates and social gossip, but one paragraph near the end made Lillian sit up straighter. "I should tell you that Theodore Whitmore has returned to Boston. He is staying with his aunt on Beacon Hill and has been seen at several social gatherings, though he is not received in the best homes anymore. The story of how he abandoned you at the altar has traveled even here. He has been asking about you, whether you returned east, whether you are well. I told him only that you had written to say you were happily settled in Utah. I hope that was right. He seemed genuinely regretful, though whether for his actions or their consequences I cannot say." Lillian refolded the letter, her emotions surprisingly calm. 6 months ago, news of Theodore's return to Boston, his apparent regret, might have affected her deeply. Now it seemed like a story about people she had once known in another life. "Bad news?" Xavier asked, joining her on the porch. "No," Lillian assured him, tucking the letter away. "Just news of someone from the past." Xavier didn't press, respecting her privacy as always. Instead, he sat beside her, his presence solid and comforting. "I was thinking about names," he said after a moment. "For the baby, oh." Lillian turned toward him, smiling at the slightly self-conscious expression on his face. "Do you have ideas?" "If it's a boy," Xavier said slowly, "I thought maybe William, after your father, and if it's a girl." He hesitated, then continued, "Maybe Rose, after my mother." Touched by his thoughtfulness, Lillian leaned over to kiss his cheek. "William or Rose, I think they're perfect." They sat together in comfortable silence as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western hills, painting the landscape in hues of gold and amber. From inside the house came the sound of Tommy's laughter at something Mrs. Landry had said, the comfortable domestic noise of family going about their day. "I never thanked you properly," Lillian said suddenly. Xavier looked at her, puzzled. "For what?" "For saving me from the fire." "For carrying my trunk through the smoke," he smiled, understanding in his eyes. "No thanks needed. I'd do it again in a heartbeat." "I know you would," Lillian replied, her hand finding his. "That's one of the many reasons I love you." As the sun set over the Utah mountains, casting long shadows across the land they now shared, Lillian thought about the strange twists of fate that had brought her here. A wedding that never happened, a fire that could have claimed her life, a chance meeting with a quiet cowboy who had become the center of her world. Sometimes, she reflected, what seems like disaster is really just the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes you have to walk through fire to find your way home.